Okay, well, I'm sitting here on the couch with the Stihl 026 crankcase fully assembled. You might have seen my previous video where I was discussing installing the bearings using the oven and refrigerator trick. So I wanted to kind of, update that video and sort of relate, what we have learned since. So if you watch the previous video, you'll see that heating up the crankcase housing and chilling the bearings does in fact install the bearings. However, what I learned after that was that that might not be really the best way to assemble this crankcase. And let me explain kind of what I ran into. So what I did after getting the bearings installed in each side of the crankcase was, prepare to assemble this, and that involves this little guy here, the crankshaft. Crankshaft comes as a assembled unit from steel. In other words, the rod is already on here, and the two halves of the crankshaft have been pressed together. So what that means is you're facing getting this part of the crankshaft pressed into the bearing on that side, and this part on this side. So what happened, as you might guess here, is I heated up, as I recall, both sides of the crankcase, and I chilled the crankshaft in the freezer for about 30-40 minutes. And then I drove in, I don't know if you can see them, but there's a indexing pin there, and then there's also one kind of down in here. So what I ended up doing on the indexing pins, we'll just cover that real quick, was I drove those in on this side all the way down. Now, ultimately you want them halfway between the two crankcase housings, but in order to kind of get them mostly out of the way, I seated them all the way down on this side case, so that only maybe 40 or 60 thousandths was exposed. So this allows me to index the gasket without having the difficulty of trying to drive them all the way into the other case, other side of the crankcase. So then once everything's screwed together, then you can take a punch and drift them to the center. So that's kind of how I did it, and I believe that's also how Stihl recommends doing it. So in any event, a couple things I ran into, a couple problems. I was concerned about the little oil pickup that's down in here, and you can see it kind of goes in here. So I had installed that initially and then put this into the oven, and of course that melted the plastic filter. Luckily I had a spare from another crankcase housing that was floating around, so I was able to save that issue. But what I did later was I just installed this once the crankcases were mated. So getting back to the bearings, the issue that I quickly ran into was when I took the frozen crankshaft, it did seat through this bearing pretty readily. So I had this down on the bench, and then I was able to get the crankshaft pressed down into that bottom bearing pretty readily. It went through and seated, and then I set this down, and what happened was this bearing here didn't want to go all the way down to where it needed to be on the crankshaft. So as a result, as I applied pressure to this to kind of force the whole thing down, it popped this bearing out. Probably the fact that the crankcase was hot didn't help. So then I found myself with a real mess. I had a hot bearing that was rapidly cooling down, and it had come out of its seat in the in the crankcase while I was trying to get the pins aligned and keep the gasket in play. So ultimately I had to just take this off, and I had to go get my my bearing puller and pull this off and kind of start over. So what I ended up doing, which worked so not perfect, was I left the crankshaft seated into this bearing here. And then what I did was I chilled the lower crankcase housing and the bearing and the crankshaft, since they were all, put together okay. And then I heated the bearing, out of the crankcase in the oven, and I then took the hot bearing and put it as far down as I could onto the crank, and it went about 3/4 of the way, and then it kind of jammed up. And then I heated up I let that cool down a little bit, although not too much. And then I had this side of the crankcase in the oven too, and I put it on, and because it was hot, and I guess the bearing had cooled down. Because it was hot, I was able to slide it down over the bearing. So that left the bearing sticking up. But the nice thing was I was then able to get the screws, and because the pins were not too because the indexing pins were not too far out, I was able to easily align this and get it pushed down past this bearing, so the bearing was still up. And then I was able to secure everything and torque down the screws. And then what I did was I took a socket, a drift that I used to drift, put it over this, and I gently tapped this down until it's seated, and I just continued to drift it down until the oil pump seated down here correctly, and I felt that the alignment of everything in here looked good as far as clearances, and I feel like it does. So that's kind of how I ended up approaching putting this whole thing together. And like I said, that works a little more effectively than individually installing each bearing, as I showed in my previous video, and then trying to assemble the whole thing. That didn't work so well. And then once everything had cooled down, then I carefully inserted this and aligned it from this side. So that worked pretty well. And then, as mentioned, I just used a long punch and drove these kind of alignment pins down to where they should be on each side. So anyways, that worked real well. And like I said, I just wanted to follow up from the previous video. So this is kind of part 2, I guess you would say, of getting the crankcase put together. Everything came out real nice. After assembling the two sides, of course, per the service manual, you have to go back and, I don't know if you can see, you have to trim the gasket that sticks up here down so that when you put the head gasket on, it doesn't interfere. So what I did for that part of the process was I took a very sharp razor blade and I carefully trimmed this off, and then I took like 1,000 grit stone and just kind of mated these two surfaces across so that everything was very flush, and that you couldn't feel any high ridges. And another thing I wanted to mention, and I wasn't aware of this till I carefully started checking things, but there's actually 2 head gaskets for this particular saw. There's one that's I believe it's 0.5 millimeter thick, and then there's a kind of low compression version that is, I believe it's 1 millimeter thick, if I'm not mistaken. So if you're building a performance kind of oriented saw, you want to be careful that you don't, inadvertently purchase the 1 millimeter thick head gasket, because that will reduce your compression a little bit by lifting up the cylinder head. So that's something to know. Okay, well, this video has run long, as all my videos do, but hopefully the subscribers on my channel are aware that I tend to go kind of long with my videos. Hope this has helped anyone working on their Stihl chainsaw. And as always, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to post them below. Okay, thanks for watching.